So I just did a video that was about cars that were cool when they came out, but today they looked decidedly uncool. And then that got me thinking about, well, what about cars that went the other way? Because as I said in that video, cars age very differently. So when they come out, they could be one thing, and midlife, they sort of start to become something else, and later on in life, they actually become quite desirable, or in some cases, something you'd never want to be seen dead in. So they do change. And our perceptions change, our viewpoints change, also how we relate to them and how we remember them. There's a nostalgia factor. All of these things add to them. So for example, my own car, the 1989 BMW 325i SE. Now, that doesn't really fit into this video, which is going to be about cars that were not so cool when they came out, but are definitely cool today. The reason I say that my BMW doesn't fit into this, because the 325i was cool when it came out. In the 80s, that was the car to have. I mean, there was definitely a hierarchy for yuppies around in the 80s, for example. And there was a case of, you worked your way up to getting a GTI, a Golf GTI, a Volkswagen Golf GTI. Once you got that, you wanted an E30, and then you worked your way through it. So 318, 320, 325i, and M3 if you could. And then after you had that, then you wanted the Porsche 911, which was like, the pinnacle. Well, actually, that wasn't the pinnacle, because after that, you wanted the Ferrari 328 or 308 because Magnum had one. So that was the kind of hierarchy, and the BMW was already in that hierarchy. But the thing that happened with the BMW, so I owned mine when I had mine previously, in the late 90s, and it was kind of like almost a decade old, I suppose, at the time. By that time, BMW had got a real image issue. And if you were like a young guy in a 3 Series, a young Asian kid in the 3 Series, then, you weren't getting thumbs up hand gestures. You were getting, let's say, different kind of hand gestures at the time. So, but the car was still great. It was a great car to drive. It's still a great car to drive today. It's just phenomenal. Just so solid and well engineered and well composed and all the rest of it. But it kind of, I would say it was kind of like a love-hate thing at that time. Now, fast forward all these years and driving this car around now, it gets so much love out on the road. I get people smiling and waving and thumbs up, and they want to talk about it, and they want to ask you about it, and their uncle had one, or their dad had one, or they used to own one, or they always wanted one. All of these things come out. And suddenly it's one of the coolest cars, honestly. To drive in London now, it is one of the coolest cars, as opposed to being not much liked a few years ago. People give me way in London, can you believe it? People will see the E30 and they'll stop. They're like, no, please. It's amazing. So, but anyway, that car, like I said, doesn't quite fit into this video, because in this video, I want to talk about cars that weren't necessarily cool when they came out, but definitely are now. And I want to talk about those right after this.
A brown car guy.
So here's a car that most of those viewers who are here in the UK may not be familiar with, but it's a car that I was very familiar with growing up in Saudi Arabia in the 1980s. So again, I talked earlier about the hierarchy of cars. And in Saudi Arabia, there was also a hierarchy of cars. And if you did reasonably well, then you had something like a Toyota Cressida, which was sort of a precursor to the Camry, I suppose. And so they were the cars to have, the Toyota Cressida. And you did well, you got yourself a Cressida. If you did a bit better, you'd have the car that I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to mention it yet. If you did a bit better than that, you got a Buick Park Avenue. You got a Buick Park Avenue with velour seats. That's what you had. And if you did really well, then the next bit of hierarchy, actually there were two. There would be the Cadillac Fleetwood, but actually what people really wanted was the Mercedes S-Class, the S-Class of the 80s. So you'd get like a 500 and then later on a 560 SEL or SEC if you were in a sporty mood, but definitely SELs. So that was the hierarchy. So the car that sat above the Cressida, the Toyota Cressida, was, to me at the time, and I believe that to be correct, the Chevrolet Caprice Classic. So if you remember this thing, late 70s to late 80s actually, because I think in 1990 it was replaced with the soap bar edition of the Caprice Classic. So I'm not talking about the soap bar one. I'm talking about the original square-shaped folded paper design, square shaped, 3-box design Caprice. And this thing, it was a relentless machine that would just chomp mile after mile after mile after mile. Bits and pieces would fall off, stop working, etc., etc. One time I know a friend of mine had one and the stereo stopped working, and I thought, I can fix that. And I couldn't, because by the time we disassembled the dashboard to get it out, we found that it was this huge thing that then had multiple layers that had to be disassembled to get into it, and we just kind of gave up. It was like, this is not possible. So in that sense, it wasn't like maybe, not the most desirable at the time, certainly not the most, quality machine or anything like that, but a solid thing. And that's all it was. It was just a solid family car, solid family saloon. So fast forward, so it wasn't like cool. Like cool was when you're talking, even the Park Avenue was cooler. Cool was the Mercedes S-Class. But the Caprice was like, yeah, okay, we've done all right. That's what we can afford. That's what we'll get. However, today, I don't see them very often. Even when I'm in the Middle East, when I was there, I didn't see them very often. When I did see one, I would lose my shit. I'd be like, oh my God, Caprice Classic. I saw a 2-door once, and I was like, I want one. I was like, I want one. It just looked awesome. And I know a buddy of mine, in America, we grew up in Saudi Arabia together, and he still adores them. He absolutely adores them, and I think now even more than ever. And I can completely understand that, because I think those things absolutely rock now. They're hugely popular in America amongst people. They like to bag them, so they do the whole lowrider thing, and they do the jumping thing, and all the rest of them. So they're really kind of cool. In America, there were taxis, but they've moved beyond that now. So these land yachts, I think now, they found their sweet spot, and I think and if you can find a good one, buy it, snap it up, keep it. I think they're fantastic. In the previous video, one of the vehicles I mentioned that was cool, now uncool, was the Hummer, particularly the H2 and the H3. Not the Humvee, because that lives in a separate sphere altogether as a dedicated military vehicle, but the Hummers. Now, similarly, in Germany, they had the Mercedes G-Wagon. The Mercedes G-Wagon was always meant to be a rugged utilitarian military vehicle. So when it first came out, that's all it was. To be honest, that's all it was. It was just like this vehicle that farmers use and the army use and people that really needed off-roaders use, and they weren't necessarily powerful. They had diesel engines. They were just like they were noisy. They were smelly, and that's what they were. So they weren't particularly cool. They were like, yeah, it's okay. It's a good vehicle. It's a German alternative to a Land Rover Defender. So that's kind of what it was. Of course, today it's a whole different story. Now it's like, rulers of Dubai, top footballers' wives, people in Russia, white G-Wagon, AMG, G63, whatever, that is the one to have, and they're just on a different level now, to the point where when they introduced the electric version of this car, I think they had about 3 or 4 of them doing synchronized tank turns in the middle of Las Vegas. So that's like how prestigious and exciting these things are. So they remain utterly cool. I have driven them. Actually, you know what? I don't really fit in them very well. So to me, they're not that cool. Although a few years ago, I think about 7 years ago, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, they did a major update, and then they certainly improved the space inside. It was much more comfortable, but the original one for me was actually very uncomfortable, like the old Defenders as well, because of my long legs. But they are very cool. So the G-Wagon is now a very cool car. Here's a real controversial one, and I think some people will not agree with me, but even when it came out, there was a concept, and then there was the actual car, the Chrysler PT Cruiser. Everybody hated it. They said it was like looked like an old-fashioned taxi or a hearse. It was pretending to be something that it wasn't. This was a car that was basically a family SUV-ish sort of car that was basically trying to be a vintage hot roddy gangster mobile sort of thing, I really appreciated the stuff. Even at the time, I loved it. I even ran one for a while, and I thought it was great. I thought it was really practical, because it was a family car. It was a manual. I had a manual gearbox, so it was fun. But it's practical. You could take the seats out, and you could take everything out and you could turn it into a van if you wanted to. It was great. And I thought they looked cool, but people absolutely hated them. And then they put out a convertible version. People hated it even more. Whereas at the time you thought, oh, this is really kind of cool. It's a convertible one, and it had a bar as well. So it had a rollover bar, and then you could put your kids in the back, and I was like, whoa. Now, however, I think the world is coming around to my point of view on this car, because I've always liked it throughout. I've never fallen out of love with the car. I've always liked it. And I think now people are really starting to like them. They're almost like they were so bad they're good sort of attitude that people have adopted with these cars. And I think they're getting cool and people are doing stuff to them. They're modifying them. And I think they're starting to really like that retro appeal, which maybe was not quite retro enough at the time that it came out, but now feels a lot more retro and in a car that you can pretty much use as a daily. So I think these are actually really cool now. So they're definitely ones to look out for. Hey, are you liking this video? Then make sure that you hit the like button. That's really important. Also, tell everybody. Ferrari. Can a Ferrari ever be uncool when it comes out? Well, yes, because if you think about the era when you had the 308, you had the 328, which were such cool cars, and of course Magnum made them even cooler, and we all wanted one. And then Ferrari said, well, what if you have family? I'll tell you what, we'll give you the Ferrari Mondial. And the Ferrari Mondial was basically one of those stretched with a little bit more sharp edges to it and two seats squeezed in between the front seats and the engine. So it's still mid-engined, rear engine, mid-engine, but they put two seats in it. And some people called it the worst Ferrari ever made. You know, the styling, people didn't really like it because it didn't really quite have that Coke bottle shape because it had been stretched out and pulled and the lines had been straightened up. So it didn't quite have that. And so people like, nah, they just like, you know, compared to the cars that existed at the time, people like, no. And it didn't really do very well. Values dived and it just didn't do really well. Look at the values of those today though, and they've crept back up again, and quite seriously. And I think they're going to continue to creep back up because now all of a sudden, especially there was a convertible version as well. 2 seats, convertible version, it was 4 seats and 2 plus 2. And now all of a sudden you're like, oh, actually, you know, they look quite good and they're practical and you can put people in them as well. So I think the Ferrari Mondial, which was not appreciated at the time, don't get me wrong, I still have a 308, 328 any day, but I wouldn't say no to a Mondial. BMW Z8. Now, I liked it when it came out. I'll be honest with you, I liked it when it came out. But and I thought it was quite cool because it was introduced. In fact, they had it in the Bond movie. They had to make lookalikes for the Bond movie because they didn't actually have the car. But BMW knew they were going to introduce it. They wanted it in the movie. So I think, I don't know, did they put it over a Mustang body or something? Or a Cobra kit body or something like that? But they basically had lookalike Z8s in the movie because they didn't have the real cars ready in time, I don't think. Maybe the Hero car was. Maybe they had one for Pierce Brosnan. But anyway, so and then you thought, well, after having the Z3, which was a pathetic car for Bond to have, and then having the 7 Series, which was kind of cool and interesting, but a bit too businessy for Bond. And then Bond got one of these, and you thought, oh, that's quite cool. And the publicity photos came out, and you thought this thing looked cool. I particularly like the interior. I like the steering wheel with the wire wire spokes that it had. I thought it was really cool. And then the movie lasted all of like, I don't know, 30 seconds. I think he moved it back and forth with his remote control key, and then it literally got cut in half right down the middle. I think it had one good looking scene where I think it drove somewhere. He drove somewhere in it on a desert road, and it looked spectacular. And the next time we saw it, they just chopped it in half. And I thought that was really sad. I was gutted when they did that. And at the time also there were some reviews that came out of the car, and people were like, the reviewers that came out, they weren't really all that nice to the car. They said that it wasn't really a sports car. To be honest, I don't think it was meant to be a sports car. You know, I mean, obviously it was harking back to the beautiful, probably the most beautiful BMW ever made, the 507. And it was meant to be a grand tourer, something that was sexy, that was grand touring, that was a style thing, that was glamorous, that, you know, you were a superstar and you wanted to be seen in it. I did get to drive one. I drove one in Dubai a few years later, and I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I couldn't see what people were talking about. I mean, yes, if you're going to try and drive it like an M3, it's not going to do it. But if you're going to cruise around in it and just look superstar cool, then yes, it was brilliant. And I think that now people have realized that, and I think people now have come back to it and gone, know what, that's a cool looking car. And I think with that steering and that interior and those curves and that style and that presence, great car. The Pontiac Aztek possibly vies with the SsangYong Rodius, the odious Rodius as I used to call it, for being the ugliest cars ever conceived and actually put into, I mean, you literally go, who greenlit these cars? Who said, yes, sign that off? That's okay. We'll put that, we'll spend, $100 million and put that into production. What? But these cars went into production. The Pontiac Aztek, really, there is no saving grace for a Pontiac Aztek. It is just terrible. It's terrible to look at, and I've never driven one, but I'm just assuming that it's going to be horrible because it's just, look at it. However, something happened. What happened? Very simple. Breaking Bad happened. Was it Walter Wright, right? The main character in Breaking Bad, he had one. And he had it for a long time within that series. So, until he eventually moves to better, cooler cars. But he had it for a long time, and it kind of became synonymous with that character. And it kind of represented that character in many ways. And I think that post that series, post that drama series, I have to concede that the Pontiac Aztek somehow is kind of cool. The Porsche Cayenne, I'm talking about the original Porsche Cayenne. When this came out, we all hated it. All us car people absolutely detested it. This was the first time a manufacturer that was dedicated to building sports cars, of course now they're all doing it, but this was the first time that a manufacturer dedicated to building sports cars decided to build an SUV. And it was Porsche. And we all hated them for it at the time. But now when you look back at it, you realize that Porsche was ahead of the game, and Porsche was thinking about the future, and Porsche was thinking about how they can save the company to keep building the cars that they really wanted to build, which was of course the 911. So that's what the Cayenne was about. At the time, I hated everything about it. I hated the design, I hated the looks, just hated that it existed. But if you look at the current Cayenne, and it kind of looks a little bit delicate, a little bit sleek and stuff like that, and you look at the original Cayenne looks like a chunky beast of a thing, you know. And actually when you think about the power that it had, what it was capable of doing, and now the presence that it's got, that I think it's matured quite nicely, then all of a sudden I'm like, that looks quite cool actually. So I would say, and then there was some special editions and some rally editions and stuff like that. So I would say that the original Porsche Cayenne now, and they're pretty cheap, so you should snap them up. But I think that they're going to be fairly iconic because don't forget, between the Cayenne and the BMW X5, these two vehicles represent the very beginning of what is a trend that has grown and blown up into something that has given us things like the Lamborghini Urus and the Ferrari Purosangue. The Volvo 240. I spent a very uncomfortable few hours in the back of a Volvo 240 with a bunch of other people after having been arrested in Saudi Arabia for driving without a Saudi license. I had a British license, but I didn't have a Saudi license. And it turned out that I needed to have a Saudi license because I was a resident of Saudi Arabia, which is maybe something that I hadn't quite realized at the time. So I got stopped, I got arrested, I got stuck in the back of this Volvo, and basically the way that they used to do it was they parked these Volvos in different places, and they waited till they filled them up with enough offenders before taking them to jail. Fortunately, I didn't have to spend the night in jail because my friend ran to my dad, who ran to his company boss, who ran to somebody who had a bit of wasta, who had ended up at the police station even before I got there and had sorted things out. So, say no more. This was back in the day, long time ago. Anyway, Volvo 240. So, kind of hated them at the time. All the police in Saudi Arabia had them, but they were tanks. They were solid tanks. They were workhorses, right? So whether you had the estate or whether you had the saloon, they were when Volvos were built to outlive humanity. That's what they were, right? And they're still around. I mean, they're still around. I still see them, even here, where they're completely non-ULEZ compliant and stuff like that. I've still seen them in London. And I think that when I do see one, I think, damn, it looks cool. And I think and to be honest, to be fair, any of the old Volvo chunky square box saloons, I'm talking right up to 740, 760, stuff like that, even 850. You see them today. I saw an 850 T5 R at the airport the other day, and I was like, whoa, it looks the business. But especially a 240 Volvo. I mean, it's just a tank of a thing, and I think that it's mega cool. Not great to drive, but solid. Finally, this is a weird one. The Honda Odyssey. Let's be honest. Apart from being actually not a bad family MPV when MPVs were actually still a thing, which they kind of aren't because we've all decided we want to drive big SUVs instead, but it was actually quite clever. It was quite a neat machine, but cool, not really. I mean, how can you be cool in a machine that says you've given up on life and had a brood of children? It's not cool. But something happened this summer. There was a certain movie that came out, probably the biggest movie of 2024, and that was Deadpool and Wolverine. And in that movie, and spoiler alert, I'm sorry, but I have to, because otherwise I can't explain this. In that movie, there's a sequence when Wolverine and Deadpool pretty much go at it, you know, multiple times, killing each other over, because of course neither character can actually die. So they kill each other over and over and over and over. And they don't do this in a massive, great expanse of a landscape and a big arena where, you know, you can see. No, they do all of that in the confines of a Honda Odyssey, which they're driving to a location, which they have to. That's the car that they ended up driving. So all of a sudden, the Honda Odyssey, which is funny because in the beginning of the movie, the Deadpool character has a go at the car, but later on, he's like, I love this car. So, so all of a sudden, I think the Honda Odyssey is very cool because of that sequence in a movie, which is the biggest movie of 2024, which was Deadpool and Wolverine. Those are my selections. I'm sure I've missed a few, and I'm sure that once I've stopped recording, I'll probably going to think of a few more cars that really fit into these categories. In fact, there are many more cars that do fit into these categories, but I want to hear from you guys. So I want you to tell me now what you think are cars that were not cool when they came out, but are very cool today, and you would have one. You know, you would have one. Explain to me what the cars were and explain to me why. And make sure you hit like, make sure you subscribe, and make sure that you stay tuned to this channel, because you never know. I might pick up on this again, and I might even talk about the cars that you've selected. Catch you all in the next video. Shout out time, guys. Thank you so much. Hey, if you enjoy my content, why not get involved? Buy me a coffee. You can do that at either of these links. Or if you're watching on YouTube, buy me a thanks or take out a membership. It all helps. It really does.